All right. Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, everybody. Welcome to our webinar. This webinar is organized by the Centers of International Business Education at Michigan State and Texas A&M University, Cybers, as part of our Research Spotlight series. The topic of today's webinar is consumer behavior in a diverging world, navigating demographic change consistent with the theme of the Academy of International Business Conference in Manchester next year. For this webinar, we invited 3 global marketing scholars who have published important work in this specific area. Our panelists will discuss their perspectives on addressing contemporary conceptual and methodological best practices necessary for publishing work in this area in major journals. This webinar will include short presentations followed by a discussion moderated by the co-hosts. David Griffith and I will be your co-hosts today. My name is Ahmed Kırca, and I'm delighted and honored to be here with you today. I'm an associate professor of international business and marketing at Michigan State University, Broad College. I also serve as the director of the International Business Center, MSU Cyber at MSU. David Griffith is from Texas A&M University, and he's been a co-editor, and he has published extensively in various journals, and he's going to be my co-host today. First, I would like to thank our participants and panelists for joining us for today's webinar and introduce our panelists. Our first speaker is Professor Fabian Bartsch from MBS School of Business. Fabian is an associate professor of marketing, and his research interests focus on cross-cultural consumer behavior, global branding, and global consumer cultures. He serves as an associate editor for the International Marketing Review, and he's in the editorial review board for the Journal of International Marketing and Journal of the Academy of Marketing Science. His work has been published in leading journals, including the Journal of the Academy of Marketing Science, JIBS, Journal of International Marketing, among others. Our next panelist is Professor Stan Westjohn. Stan is associate professor at the University of Alabama. His research interests center primarily on international marketing strategy, focusing on how consumers respond to different marketing, branding, and positioning strategies. Stan has published research in, among others, the Journal of International Marketing, JIBS, Journal of the Academy of Marketing Science, and International Marketing Review. He currently serves on the editorial review boards of the Journal of International Marketing and International Marketing Review. Our third panelist is Professor Irem Yurik. Irem recently graduated from Wayne State University, and she's assistant professor of marketing at Cal State University, Los Angeles. Her research focuses on multicultural market spaces and cross-cultural issues' impact on consumer and societal well-being. She published work in the European Journal of Marketing and Psychology of Marketing. Now I will pass the proverbial microphone to David, who will lead the discussion during this panel. Enjoy.
Howdy, welcome everyone. Great to see so many friends here today. I'm looking through the participant list. Wonderful, absolutely wonderful. If you have any questions, throw them up in either the webinar chat or the Q&A. We will hold most questions till the end, giving each speaker about 10 to 15 minutes to speak. So without further ado, let me turn over the mic to Fabian, and off we go.
Yes, thank you very much. Let's see if this works on my end. Are we good? All right. Thank you very much for the kind invitation and for the kind words about myself. I'm happy to see that there are some familiar faces also among the people joining for the webinar. Yeah, my name is Fabian. I'm an associate professor based in France, and I've taken this assignment that was given to us with the view of trying to inspire some or highlight some future problems we might see with this diverging change and highlighting a little bit what I see are, let's say, 3 research questions I think are somewhat important and we have to address. Now, when we talk about demographic change, I'm based in Europe, so I looked at the European Commission, and they basically say demographic change is the study of how old we become as consumers or as people, how many children we have, and how do we spend our lives, and how this is going to change as we age. There's 3 prime examples which kind of underline the problem for me. We see that the world population will become a lot older by 2050. So we will have more people that are over 65 than that are under 15, which is something we haven't seen for ever. We see that our fertility rates are declining. The prime example is always Korea, that has an extremely low fertility rate, which is far below the common replacement level, meaning the level needed to kind of keep populations at the same level. But we see this across other markets as well. Most developed markets, whether it's the US, whether it's Canada, whether it's France, Australia, they all have fertility rates which are a little bit below the replacement rate, meaning that these markets are basically shrinking. And then we see one continent where, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of insights from published research, which is Africa. In 2050, Africa will become the dominant populous continent in the world, with 1 in 4 of the world's under 25 actually originating from Africa. So I would project that Africa will become the focus of our attention, because we have a lot of young consumers there, we have a lot of working power there. So this content will dramatically change, and it won't be as it is today. Now, in order to understand this, I figured let's look a little bit at the past. And the Australian government took the United Nations World Population Report, which is an annual publication on how the world is supposed to develop in the years in the future. And this was the picture in the 75 years ago. We see that basically the world was split. We had emerging markets indicated by the light bubbles here, where life expectancy was quite small, hovering around the age of 40, 45. And we had the developed world where the life expectancies were around 65. At the same time, we saw that the emerging world, or the emerging markets, are growing, and even the developed markets were growing with fertility rates above the replacement rate. So that gave impetus for a lot of interesting research questions. Now, if we move on and consider a little bit how the world looks like today, we see that the picture is still similar. Also, I would say it has improved a little bit in terms of how long we live. We see that the developed world, we're becoming much older. The average age is going to be around 80, 85, depending on what country you look at. But we also see that emerging markets basically have caught up. Quality of life has improved, healthcare has improved. And if we now consider the fertility rates, we see exactly what I said in the beginning. Developed markets basically have very low fertility rate, below the replacement rate, while emerging markets seem to continue to grow with a few exceptions here and there. So we still study differences between emerging and developed markets in our research question. Now, the data looks much further ahead. So if we skip another 75 years, this is what's being projected. So in 2100, we basically see that there's a level of convergence taking place. Most of the emerging markets, so that's kind of the medium blue bubbles, they have increased their life expectancies, but they also have fertility rates which are below the replacement rate, which means those markets that are still growing are the ones that we would nowadays call less than developed to some extent. So that obviously has some implications for our market research questions, but also for marketing strategy and how is it used in practice, and how we kind of need to see this world. And I will not talk about the entire time about 2100, but I want to talk about the time in between. Now, how did this transformation take place? There are basically 5 drivers that I identify in the literature. The first one is we have what we call a rise in socioeconomic development. Parents basically decide that while they're making more money and they have more access to resources, they are not having more children because they invest more money into the single children they have. Those money goes towards education, towards the healthcare, but also to give children those opportunities. So frequently families decide to basically only have 1 child over 2 or 3 or even 4, as it was in the past. On top of that, we have a very positive development. Education levels are at an all-time high, especially among women, which in the 50s and 60s were not part of the traditional, let's call it paid workforce. They do a lot of work that is unpaid. And this obviously has led to delayed in family formation. So less kids are being born. On top of that, we have advancements in healthcare and healthcare technology and technology in general that extends our lifespan. And it has also reduced the requirements for manual labor, which traditionally was a driver of larger families. We need people to work on the farms, etc. We also recently, and that's the debate for lots of elections taking place around the world, we have a lot of urban economic pressure. It becomes very expensive to raise children, whether this is school tuition fees or whether this is setting up sufficient housing spaces in mostly urban societies where all the jobs basically take place. And on top of that, we have families that have caregiving responsibilities for aging families. So that creates barriers to creating families and creating kids and creating bigger families. And lastly, and this is where we go a little bit towards more consumer culture and consumer behavior in general, we observe a growing shift. There's a growing acceptance of a child-free lifestyle. The terminology DINK, I think some of you might know this, dual income, no kids households, is increasing. We have also lots of people that live by themselves and don't live in shared apartments anymore. And people tend to reflect or prioritize a little bit their economic freedom, career fulfillment, and personal development over having children, which all kind of accumulates to the same problem. And so what are going to be the consequences for this? If we observe the decline in fertility rates in the developed world, which is largely what we would call Western markets, I would assume that there's going to be a redistribution of power from West to East, meaning that Eastern markets will become much more powerful. And we can already observe this with some of the Eastern economies taking a central position in our lives. On top of that, we have new centers of consumer innovation. So innovation will not originate from Western markets anymore, but from Eastern markets, because this is where most of our youth will be living to some extent. We will see new innovation patterns. Emerging markets are slowly becoming the driver of innovation because of their sheer economic power and of this sort of shifting of economic centers. And we will also see that different from today, younger non-Western consumers, they will eventually act as early adopters for the things that are being innovated, the products, the technology, etc. And one last thing that we also see is that, and that's something we don't really have a lot of research on, the African continent continues to be somewhat of a black box. It's projected to be a very important populous region of the world, but most of our studies in all the major journals, they focus on Western consumers or consumers from China or consumers in general from Asia, with very few studies focusing on understanding the African consumer. Now, if we face the reality that the society is aging, we need to look at the variable of aging and how this can be interpreted against a sort of international marketing background. If we look at the traditional kind of division in the world, we see there are some individualistic societies and collectivistic societies. Here, some of the literature argues that the way age is understood differs dramatically between these types of cultural domains or cultural regions. We have individualistic societies which obviously emphasize independence, self-fulfillment, active aging, or having personal achievements as you age. While collectivistic cultures, they focusing much more on the family as a core social network. They talk about intergenerational legacy, how this is carried on from one person to the next. And there's much greater respect for elders as the wisdom of the family. We can take this further and look at life stages. Here we have societies which tend to be a little bit more youth-centric, and these societies tend to struggle with what I would call aging stereotypes. They view aging as something that is declining in performance and something that you need to take care of. While traditional cultures, they're most likely embracing aging. They see this as a source of wisdom, as a source of mentorship, or even as a source of social status. And this translates basically, and some societies will accept the so-called graceful aging process. They celebrate this process. It's a natural progression. It's something that's very authentic. And then there are some societies that will try to fight it. And they will try to fight with all sorts of products that marketers can offer and promote and strategize. And this is basically the phenomenon of anti-aging, whether these are creams, whether these are certain products, certain active lifestyles. So this is also how we can basically segment societies. And it should be clear that this obviously creates very different market strategies depending on the market you're operating in. So how should marketing practice adapt to this? I believe we need to think a little bit beyond age segmentation when it comes to that large part of society which will age, is already aged or will age in the future. Here, the segmentation requirements should focus much more on lifestyle differences, on health status, but also on digital fluencies. Most of our generation, once we age, we brought up with technology. So that's a differentiator marketers can use. And so if we, for instance, look at sort of stereotypical groups, we have the digital seniors, the seniors that are still working at the age of 70 or 75. We have the active retirees, which do engage a lot of sports. These are all groups that are not yet really well researched and not well understood. And they obviously differ amongst themselves. So age is not the variable that will help us understand them. We should also look at product innovation in a different way. We will have much more age-adapted products and much more, we need to kind of move away from our youth-focused innovation strategies, which always try to target the early adapters with new technology. If the largest segment in the market is not going to be necessarily young, the early adapters will be the seniors. So marketers need to prepare for that and focus on different elements there. And lastly, we will see that migration will become a necessity. We observe across the world that, many political systems, political parties, they're strictly against migration, which is a bit weird because most of the societies that have this political agenda, and that's not just the US, that's many countries in Europe as well, and even in some other markets, they need to rely on immigrants basically to keep their economy going. And as long as people don't have more kids, we need migration. And this will definitely transform a little bit the national identities we currently study and we currently observe, because we will have much more melting pots, and especially in those, what I would call multicultural urban marketplaces. This brings me to 3 broad research questions that I think you could consider working on. First of all, research question around the idea of, okay, what's the family life cycle and how this will change? We're losing a little bit the traditional family role model as society changes, ages, and we have less kids to focus on. That model is characterized by, double income, no kids partners, single person households, multi-generational caregiving, which all create some sort of non-linear life trajectory compared to what we're used to. On top of that, in international marketing and also to some extent in international business, we draw on different acculturation models. Most of these models assume that there's migration happening to Western societies. However, in reality, with the shifting or with a change in demographics, we will observe much more flows between non-Western countries. So going from what now are emerging markets to emerging markets, but even South-South migration patterns. So these are all things that are not necessarily captured in these acculturation models. And lastly, I believe we need to move beyond the so-called weird samples. We need to slowly reduce studying Western-educated, industrial-rich democracies in order to be much better prepared to the rise of Africa in terms of what kind of challenges and opportunities we face as researchers there, but also to better reflect the reality of tomorrow. And currently, we rarely do this. And I think I stayed somewhat in my time. That's my thoughts. Thank you very much.
Excellent questions in the chat. Keep them coming. Panelists will take a look at them and we will handle them within the Q&A. Let's move on to our next speaker. Stan, Fabian, can you unshare your screen?
Yes.
Okay, and I guess it's my turn to share my screen. So, all righty. Can you see that okay? Closing meeting controls, there we go. Okay. Oh, I see lots of thumbs up there, so good. It's kind of fun seeing little thumbs flying up my screen. Hello everyone. Thank you for attending today, and thank you to David at Texas A&M and Ahmet at Michigan State for hosting this. My few points here to make about changing demographics, and some of it will overlap. Actually, we didn't coordinate our slide decks, but there are some surprising overlaps and perhaps maybe a little bit different perspective here and there. But I'll focus primarily on issues related to identity, but also on points related to technology adoption and even on persuasion and selling and marketing as populations grow older. So my goal here is to kind of highlight some potential future research opportunities as this international context begins what could be a really tremendous change for the world. So let's see here next. Okay. All right, so this is kind of fun, I thought. Most of you are probably familiar with these population pyramids. If not, these represent the distribution of ages across a population and even kind of splits male from female. And we have on the far left kind of the classic, probably the origin of it. This is why it's called a pyramid, that's a growing population. And then on the far right is kind of the other extreme, kind of the depopulation, if you will. And I don't know if I can trademark this, but I'm calling them population diamonds instead of population pyramid. So population pyramid, TM, Stan Westjohn. So there you have it. So we're going from pyramids to diamonds. And this is a nice, illustration of the change that's been happening in society. And these are all our 2024 population estimates for different parts of the world. So just a quick question if you want to have some fun. There are 2 countries and 1 continent listed on here. So take your best guess at what A, B, and C might represent. I'm not sure I can see what comments are coming in, but as you think about it, it does ironically overlap a little bit with what Fabian talked about. That big pyramid on the left under A is the whole continent of Africa. And then on the far right, again, coincidentally, is South Korea, the one with the lowest fertility rate. And this kind of funny cucumber shape, pointy cucumber shape in the middle is the United States. And so that's where it resides. And when I share this with students, of course, I tell them I'm not trying to make any political commentary, but the reason it looks as good as it does is precisely because of migration and what Fabian had alluded to earlier. So people can debate the merits of that or not, but they can't really, it's hard to debate the facts on that matter. So the shifting population pyramids are becoming, quite typical for the distinction between developed and emerging markets. And so I did a bit of my own research, and I won't go through all this because I think Fabian covered some of this, but this is from Euromonitor and looking at the year 2000, then 24, and then forecasted to 2040, just looking at what these median ages are. And it also puts a little in context about, what do we mean by an old age society? So in developed countries, as of 2024, the median age was 43. I guess that might be old age compared to some. To me, it seems quite young. And in emerging markets, it's 30 as of today. And both of those societies or groups of countries, if you will, are aging. It's just one's aging or at an older age already, starting from a higher age, but they both seem to be aging at a relatively similar pace. And fertility, of course, as Fabian pointed out, greatly dropping, but it's also dropping in these emerging markets as well. And even in 15 years, 16 years from now in 2040, expected to be above replacement rate in those emerging markets. I'll skip over old age dependency, but that's basically how many young workers are supporting old retirees, which I hope we all hope to be one someday. And then with the income per capita, this I found kind of interesting because there's almost, we talk about these divergent societies. In some ways, we're kind of converging as well. And so here, this 8x, 4x, and 3x suggests that the rich countries were 8 times wealthier than the emerging and developing countries in 2000. And then as of last year, they were 4 times as wealthy. I mean, that's a tremendous jump. And then the estimates are only 3 times as wealthy 16 years from now. So rich and getting richer for the developed country and poorer, but gaining some ground in the developing markets. So I don't know if it's really diverging in that sense, but it's certainly lots of changing going on. And surely we'll see shift in consumption patterns, shift in demand for different types of goods and services, particularly for the older markets. And one thing I thought about is whether emerging markets, especially like Fabian, commented on Africa, and gosh, people have been talking about the development of Africa for decades, it seems like, and it always seems like it's always the great potential out there that just hasn't risen up, and who knows why. I mean, I certainly can't explain it, but it's been talked about a lot. And so one question I have is whether these emerging markets, like those in Africa or in other parts of the world, as they become wealthier, what will they look like? Will they adopt consumption patterns similar to what we see and witness today in the rich developed countries? Or will they develop their own consumption patterns? I mean, you consider they have different institutional environments, both formal and informal, so that will kind of shape those consumption patterns. So I don't think it's something we can just look at what happens today in the rich world and project that on, when these emerging markets, when they become richer, they'll be just like the rich world is today. I can't imagine that's going to be the case, just because the environment is just changing so rapidly, and of course projecting out is very hard to do. So and then the other question is, how will this existing set of developed countries consumers change over time as the society ages? So it's this question of aging that really intrigues me the most, and perhaps because I'm getting closer. I'm an unashamed doting grandfather now. For those of you who might be curious, thank you, David. And I feel like I'm cold all the time. I eat at 5 o'clock. I go to bed at 8:30, and then get up 3 times in the middle of the night. So. I saw an actor, Ted Danson, say in a show recently, he said the good thing about eating dinner at 5 is happy hour starts at 3. So I guess we have that to look forward to. But anyway, I tried to focus my kind of talk a little bit more on the implications of an aging society, and not to suggest that the emerging markets are somehow less important. But it's kind of hard to focus on so many different things. So I just mainly looking at the effects of these aging societies as it gets older. So of course, one practical implication of this is greater reliance on foreign-born labor, and greater reliance on technology and automation, because there's fewer working age adults, and that's for whatever manufacturing we might have here, or service industries. You see in the news occasionally Elon Musk or others talking about these android robots walking around, being assistants, could be home caretakers, caregivers. So you can see where my mind is as I go go through this. One thing I really am curious about is how might societal norms, values, and attitudes change with an aging society. So I don't really know. I'm not a sociologist, but I would tend to think that the norms of a society, at least, are probably predominantly influenced by the majority of society. And as the majority of society becomes older and older and older, it seems like a logical conclusion to draw that whatever values, attitudes that the majority have, those are going to somehow affect the norms of society overall. So, how that changes, I don't know. Listen to Fabian's comments. He commented a bit about how the aged are viewed differently in certain societies, and in some places they're revered, and in other places they're kind of sidelined and relegated to let's put mom's old and she can't take care of herself anymore, so let's go put her in a home somewhere, and we'll go visit her once a month or occasionally on a weekend or something like that. So very different attitudes toward the ages. So I don't know. I only mention that to suggest like how, if the majority is the old, then will the rest of society really want to adopt those attitudes? And it might depend upon to what degree they revere the old and respect the old and follow the older generations in society. So I think all these differences matter, especially in marketing in terms of messaging, product design, marketing positioning, and promotion in different societies. So I think those are going to be some potential implications of this aging society. So as thinking through this, I was trying to follow this, hopefully a logical process here. So I wonder, well, what are the correlates of age? And so what are these attitudes that we typically find in older consumers? And I looked back at a little bit of my own research, and Jim paper from 2012 looked at responsiveness to global and local consumer culture positioning. So I just went back and looked at the data, and it's like, well, what's the correlation with age there? And what we found is as consumers age, they are increasingly identifying with their own country. So their national identification increases. And this may, fit with, maybe common stereotypes we have, that older people being more insular and more protective. And, it's, there might be some truth in that in some ways, but this one study here of mine would tend to suggest that. I also looked at, some other research and gerontology and things like that, and found that there's research to support that as we get older, we're more risk averse than we are when we're younger. And kind of paradoxically, I guess, is there's a greater generalized trust in others. So that's what I thought really strange. We're more risk averse on one hand, but more likely to trust people on the others. And I don't know if it ties in directly, but I think about like all these crazy texts and messages we're getting all the time. Oh, click, you forgot pay your toll in Florida, click here. Or, hey, there's this, I've got $1 million locked up in a bank account. If you just share your bank account number with me, I can help share the wealth with you. And so there's this trust that may have lend maybe some believability to sales claims and for selling with older populations. But at the same time, they're more risk averse. So one wonders whether we have to do more risk mitigation. So these three tendencies correlated with age: stronger national identity, higher risk sensitivity, and higher trust, may very well shape marketing in aging societies, especially for global brands. So looking at this intersection of implications of aging societies and these tendencies for older age consumers, it may influence how identity plays a role in global marketing. So, first of all, will there be a stark split between the young and the old? And will there be kind of more tension there than what exists currently? So, the young, growing up, finding their independence, wanting to chart their own path. And when they're the majority, it seems like it's easier to do that, and you don't have someone pressing their thumb down on you in terms of societal norms. But if you got a very large old age cohort, always like trying to shame you and wagging their finger at you, it's like, well, are they going to embrace that, or is that going to cause some tension there? So and especially layering on that these old age dependencies where we're going to get to the point where it's one worker supporting one or perhaps even more than one retiree in terms of social benefits in old age. So also, like with increasing national identification, if we have more foreign born workers in the country, in any of these richer countries, like, well, there are going to be tensions that need to be resolved there too with these older consumers. And if older consumers tend to respond better to localized or localization strategies like local consumer culture positioning, what does that mean for global brands that are really kind of trying to leverage standardization as much as they can to make their organizations and their brands globally successful? Is it going to be too segmented at some point? And so is that going to put constraints on the size of some global multinationals? So that's kind of getting broader outside consumer behavior, but there is some effects on that. I've got a little research conducted on consumer animosity, and again, one wonders whether that will be even more prominent, play a more prominent role in cross-cultural marketing as these consumers age and be a little more tied to the home country as well. And then finally, and I thought this is really interesting, Fabian, what you said, that it's time to get beyond just age segmentation and to look at, like, okay, well, we can't, old age consumers are not just one monolithic group, and it's really kind of hard to argue with that point, of course. But at the same time, I wonder if there is potentially going to emerge this cross-national segment, like we've talked about in the past. Maybe there's a global youth segment that cuts across cultures. Will there be a global senior segment, if you will, at least in terms in the rich countries, so across Europe and North America in particular? Are there enough commonalities there to have this global senior segment there as well? So David, I trust you'll let me know if you need to pull the hook. So I just got promised just 2 more slides. Occupational hazard. So the last comment on identity here is consumer disidentification. Now, this is a concept that was brought up, over a dozen years ago by Josiason. And honestly, I have no idea how well it was received. I can only infer that because there's not been a lot of follow-up research on this concept, that for some reason maybe it wasn't well received. I don't know, but I also tend to think that if societies are becoming more diverse, there might be an increased likelihood of consumer disidentification. And also, in the current environment of increased political polarization, will there be home country natives who are wanting to reject the identity of their home country because of what's happening at a national scale? And so I think these are some potentially interesting questions to follow up on as well. And consumer behavior may shift in some unexpected ways because of it. So consumer disidentification, I think, is maybe a potential avenue to explore a bit more of what are its antecedents and what are its consequences, and perhaps how marketers might be able to mitigate its effects. And then last slide here is getting back to risk aversion and trust with respect to especially with like technology adoption. We've published just this year how distance influences persuasion effectiveness. We looked at Cialdini's influence principles of persuasion. If you've not read that book, I highly recommend it. But looking at like authority versus consensus versus scarcity and so forth, and it varies which tactic is more effective depending upon the distance and similarities between cultures. We also know that collectivism kind of enhances trust. And so one wonders if persuasion is heavily reliant on trust and reducing uncertainty, will some tactics work better in some cultures than others? I think that's an unanswered question yet. At the same time, for aging cultures that might be more trusting initially, will we need to do more risk mitigation for those? So even though they trust the seller more, will they need more assurances or some sort of insurance, I guess, to suggest that they're not going to be at a loss or risk of loss at some point? And again, tie this in with an increased foreign workers and foreign-based workers in the marketing environment, and you can see kind of how that intersection of this divergence and change is influencing marketing. Finally, this tech adoption piece, we know that these older Western, richer countries are going to have to rely more on tech adoption. So how can we convince these older consumers to actually adopt it? So beyond the fact of use in manufacturing and so forth, but as old age consumers are increasingly required to adopt technology, how can we encourage them to do so? Especially that they have this national identification tendency that might be working against this. An older paper of mine from 2009 shows that global identification is positively related to technology readiness and adoption. So that would seem to infer that older folks, older generations are going to be a little less receptive to tech adoption. And I think in the age of AI and potentially talking about AI companions for retirees to combat loneliness or give them some sort of outlet, and there's a whole nother conversation to say if that's really socially helpful for them. But maybe it's an intervention that's necessary when a human is lacking in that sense. So ultimately, how will these ultimately affect consumer behavior, and how can marketers most effectively reach these segments? I think is the big question. So in the end, to tie back to the beginning, we need to help to identify the value in the diamonds, if you will. This shift from population pyramids to population diamonds, I think, could be really, really substantial. I don't believe it's a crisis. And I don't even think it's a foregone conclusion. 40, 50 years ago, the best demographers, their biggest worry was, for those of you on a little older side will remember, overpopulation of the world. We were worried about having too many people and not enough food to feed them. And of course, what are we worried about now? Depopulation and obesity. So, that just goes to show like these estimates are not necessarily our future, but they're all we have to go on right now. So as this context change, I think it actually presents great opportunities for researchers and more opportunities to ask new questions and find new answers in international marketing. So thank you so much for your time and attention.
Thank you, Stan. Wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. Stan, Fabian, if you want to answer any of the questions in the chat or the Q&A, please feel free to. Stan, if you can stop sharing your screen and we can bring Iram on board, our last speaker of the day.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm sharing my screen. Oh, 1 second. I cannot share my screen. Hopefully this works. All good?
Perfect.
Thank you. Thank you so much, David, Ahmed, Stan, and Fabian for this wonderful webinar. I'm really excited to share a couple other ideas that will hopefully inspire your future research. I wanted to talk a little bit more about how divergence impacts consumer attitudes, identities, and behavior from the lens of this demographic change that Fabian and Stan gave a very good inspiration about. We all may have heard of Apodry's research where I can send this down. He looks at globalization's impact on consumer psychology. Flow of people, flow of images, flow of technology, capital, and ideas across borders have been changing consumers as people see media, technologies, ideas from other cultures and imbibe on these. We can actually also kind of argue that there has been more convergence around positive attitudes towards globalization, where during the 90s and 2000s, people were excited about this idea and were adopting more pro-globalization attitudes, which also led to consumption of global goods, excitement around global brands that were going into markets that were all over the world, and also being exposed to these global brands and global ideas that we saw around us. Apodry also suggested that, yes, there is an impact of globalization on consumer identities. However, it's not necessarily a one-way stream where, globalization impacts identities to become more global. He actually argued that some people are going to, as mentioned, I think by Stan and Fabian, it's going to actually also lead to disidentification, double identification of global and local, which we call globalization, or basically dropping identification with the global world, which we call disidentification. So he was one of the first people that was out there that said anything that we see as a force in the world, such as globalization, is going to lead to diverse groups of people in terms of how people receive this, and people are complicated. We will see homogenization, heterogenization, globalization, deterritorialization as a result of such global forces. I want to cue in something that's going to be a bit more interesting, hopefully, which is anti-globalization. So today we're living in a world where we see a lot more anti-globalization sentiments going around, especially those of us who are in the US have daily news of how our community is trying to be separated, not necessarily being brought together, but separated. Some other examples for anti-globalization sentiments across the globe are Brexit. We have witnessed UK leaving the EU. We are experiencing America First strategies, buy American goods, kind of propaganda that's going on in the US. We have witnessed in India an economic nationalism led by Atmanir Bahar Bharat. We see in China dual circulation, an attempt to reduce foreign dependency. And then we also see examples of far-right nationalism in Europe with the election of a lot of right party leaders, etc. I have this example on the right of U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE trying to deport an individual on the right, which is very generally common in the news today, that, you know, is something that we can think about as we're thinking about coexistence of diverse groups in different countries in the world today. So we're seeing some disruption to that as a result of anti-globalization forces and anti-globalization sentiments. A couple other hopefully fun examples I have over here for you is that Canadians changed the name of Americano, a very predominantly known coffee drink across the world, to Canadiano in the beginning of 2025, as Trump was beginning to impose a lot of high tariffs on Canada specifically, but also across different countries in the world. Canadians also decided to pull US liquor from shelves as US decided to impose tariffs on foreign goods. I have a few more other examples for you in terms of how is anti-globalization impacting the consumer today. We see more and more groups boycott certain groups of brands. One example is that Western communities actually decide to boycott the Xinjiang cotton because of state-sponsored forced labor of Uyghur and other Turkic Muslim minorities in the production of Xinjiang cotton. We see boycotts of French products in Muslim-majority countries because of President Macron's comments on secularism. We see more and more commonly anti-Amazon protests going on in North America and Europe, which are all caused by perceived cultural or political insult or anti-exploitation of labor in the world. Another example is the local supporting movements, locavore movements, it's a French word, where consumers favor locally sourced food products and services, even though they don't necessarily have very strong national identities or very strong, national ties, just for the sake of resistance to global agribusiness and the exploitation that is predominantly happening by global businesses on different species, sometimes not necessarily only on different species such as animals, plants, environment, and also as a resistance to homogenized food cultures. Two other examples I have is digital nationalism. We see more and more digital nationalism happen in the world where countries ban applications supported by other countries. We saw the ban of TikTok in the US, WeChat in the US. India is also banning these apps. China has been banning apps across the whole country that are produced by other countries. And the reasons is like around data sovereignty. We don't want to share our national data with China. China doesn't want to share its data with us or with India. Russia also developed its own internet infrastructure. So we're seeing more cultural protection and national security protection happen across the world. My last example is cultural protectionism, where, for example, South Korea limited film screening of foreign films in the cinema to be able to promote South Korean film industry more so in its government, in its country. So there has been some research on how is both globalization and anti-globalization is impacting consumer identity and attitudes, less so of how anti-globalization is impacting consumer attitudes and identity. There's a very good example of research done by Cleland, LaRoche, and Papadopoulos in 2022 on anti-global spaces. anti-globalscapes, which is consumer orientations that oppose or resist global consumer culture. And then there are a few maybe smaller in their broadness studies that look at different forces like anti-Walmart, anti-McDonald's in terms of resistance to global brands. We also see some research on how people are reflecting their different boycott behavior on digital communities or social media. And there has been more traces of people actually resisting to global movements online as well. My research also looks at the impact of anti-globalization on global identity. And in one of the papers that we are still working on, actually, with Isbek, Bilgin, and Strashakova, we look at the impact of anti-globalization on global identity, where we see different values emerge among people towards basically humanity and belonging with the whole group of humanity in the world. And we see more sentiments for equality and human rights across everyone in the world. We see more appreciation of diversity. We found traces of more people doing environmental stewardship, and also a global growth mindset where global people are trying to learn from others more, and that others are different cultures, different groups of people. And this reflects on people's consumer behavior in terms of we see more anti-consumption, we see more consumption of local goods, artisan goods, we see more consumption of sustainable goods, and as also mentioned earlier, some antagonism towards global brands. So the question is that I want to pose for you for inspiration for research for the future is that what is other impacts of anti-globalization on consumers? Are we going to be able to see more harmonious coexistence of diverse groups in the same markets or not so much so? What kind of harmonious things we're going to be able to observe? Also, consumer disidentification from global identity has been a topic, but also consumer disidentification from national identity, as Stan just brought it up, is that something that we will see, especially more and more so with the separationist news that we're receiving about our world around us. There are many things to consider, and this is also where I'm going to end my presentation.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. We have a number of comments, so we've got about half an hour left. I'm going to try to do about 20 minutes of Q&A with our panelists on the general concepts that we've been talking about, and then about 10 minutes of really quick guidance for authors, if you will. So I'm going to start with the first question to Fabian. Given the shifting demographics and migration patterns, one of the sets of comments that came up was, all ethnic groups are not equal. Some have very high growth rates and some have very low birth rates within different countries, which is really making for a quite confusing world. How does the migration patterns and then shifting demographics play into our understanding of global consumer behavior?
That's a good question. That's a complicated question, which makes it nice. I think it's basically we'll observe a change in I think what I call the national identity. So typically you look at national identity, which is the common identity of people living in a society about the nation, right? So if the composition of that nation is changing as a consequence of aging and migration patterns, whether these are ethnicities, religion, different countries, etc., I think we will observe a change in what captures a national identity. So today we might have a national identity that's extremely patriotic about the achievements in history and tradition, etc. Well, if the society consists of 40% migrants basically who not have that experience, that part of the national identity becomes less important. Maybe it becomes more about recent events. Maybe it becomes more about ideally harmonically living together and making this work. I used to study in Canada. It was known to be an absolute melting pot where different cultures, different religions live very peacefully next to each other. And it's not about all being the great Canadian accomplishments, but it's about the fact that they serve as a society to work and live together. So I think in the best case scenario, we will see that happening. So there's a positive shift. In the worst case scenario, I think that we see what Irem was picking up. We'll have more problems because we'll have one part of society which kind of fights for the old ways, and another part that says, look, we need to change, but we're also not willing to give into that. So it might create more tension in the short to medium run. While in the long run, there's a replacement, and that replacement, it's not something we can really change. But societies will have to learn to adapt to this, and that's without any judgment whether this is positive or negative.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. The next one's going to go to Stan. What are the different implications for global marketing researchers or scholars in terms of the key constructs that we examine in international marketing and in consumer behavior as it relates to the period comparison to the diamond countries? You're on mute too.
That's a shame because I was saying something really brilliant at the time, and now I've completely forgotten it. But all right, so just to make sure I understand the question, I guess. So the pyramid countries versus the diamond countries. Yeah, I mean, what constructs? I think, I mean, especially, well, I mean, to some degree, I think for the pyramid countries, we maybe have a little bit of a template for that already based on the existing or the not too distant history of the developed economies. Again, with a major asterisk of whether or not as they get richer, if they become more like the rich countries have been, or if they chart their own path in terms of context and character. I think for diamond countries, I think constructs, I don't know if they're new constructs. I wasn't prepared to do new construct development on a webinar. But thinking about, I think generally just kind of openness to change has got to be a really important construct in terms of trying to gauge which societies that, despite their old age, might be more prone to openness because of other related cultural values or traditions. And again, that might and somehow might be related to how those societies view those older cohorts. So I think openness is probably a key one. And well, and then I guess in part of my answer is maybe trying to identify, to really quantify, maybe it's out there, I don't know, about how older segments of society are viewed and revered and characterized across countries. And potentially, is that changing over time as well? And so, are there societies where the older cohorts have been revered, but now they're no longer revered in a particular society? Or is it, of course, the broad stereotype is that a lot of Asian, very broadly speaking, of course, Asian countries tend to hold older cohorts, I believe, in more esteem than what do the more individualistic, especially kind of American type society does, generally speaking. And I guess that, we can see the evidence of that, of how desperately older Americans try to look youthful and invest in all these procedures and cosmetics and so forth to look years younger than what they are. So I hope I didn't offend anybody on the call with that comment. Present company excluded, because we're all very youthful and vigorous looking.
Excellent, excellent. Iram, could you please explain how war between countries could be affecting consumer behavior and global scapes?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And also, these are all really complicated questions, of course. We are seeing very top of my head is consumer animosity and of course boycotts of goods from the countries that we are in war with. So Russians are not going to consume goods from Ukraine, etc. And also we see some boycotts. Actually, Isbek Bilgin has a really good paper on how it's a qualitative paper. There was a question in the chat about how qualitative work can aid global research. It can aid it super amazingly. So Isbek Belgin has a research on looking at Muslim majorities, minorities, no, Muslim minorities, I believe she looks at, and how they of course, Turkey is a majority Muslim country, so she must be looking at some sort of minorities within the country and how they are using global brands. And we see some boycotts of Coca-Cola because Coca-Cola is supporting Israel. So there are some trends that we see across the world in terms of, groups, Muslim groups in different countries will be boycotting certain brands, global brands specifically, because they are aiding certain wars in the manner that they don't agree with. At the same time, we see brands exiting countries. So that's the second thing I want to mention. As a result of war, we see global brands that are operating in the war countries leave the country. So now there is a whole perhaps good study space of Russia where McDonald's, IKEA, Pepsi, Coca-Cola, all these global brands were doing very well in the country, but they were almost forced to leave as a result of the war with Ukraine, where it left the country with this marketplace of pure openness. And Russians are now replicating these businesses and opening up local versions of McDonald's or local versions of IKEA. I've gone through this rabbit hole of watching YouTube videos of what has been predominantly taking place of all the global brands that were in the market right now in Russia. And they're really good YouTube videos in terms of, there is basically IKEA, but it's not called IKEA and it's just locally owned and operated in the country right now. So there is a need for all the goods that we already have in the markets, but because of political forces, sometimes ownership changes, sometimes what we support changes. And this is not really doing a good job answering your question because there should be a good thought process of weeks and weeks to see what the impact is, but that's my 2 cents.
Oh, that's actually great. I'm going to ask you to stay unmuted because now I'm going to reverse order it. I'm going to start with Iram, go to Stan, and go to Fabian. So, Iram, you had talked a great deal about the implications of anti-globalization, right? And one of the questions that came in is, can you speak to both the good side of anti-globalization from a consumer behavior perspective, as well as sort of the bad side in terms of, thinking about our research?
Of course. Good side of anti-globalization is that we as consumers and humanity are noticing that what we see on the ads or what we see on the facet of anything is not necessarily true. And we're doing more research as to what is actually going on. Some examples that come really quickly to my head is basically how, for example, Apple has been treating its labor across different markets. Now we have Starbucks treating its workers differently. So everyone loves Starbucks, but there's all these sentiments that are rising against Starbucks in terms of, oh, they should really treat its workers right, and therefore maybe we shouldn't be supporting this brand because they're really not treating its workers right. That is a good result of anti-globalization because we're becoming more aware and sensitive towards how brands are treating its workers, or treating the environment. From all three levels of ESG, as consumers, we're more sensitive. Perhaps it doesn't actually make us stop using Starbucks, but we have it in our brains like, oh, this is not a very good brand after all. I'm still drinking this, which is a good seed to plant in the consumer's brains, because eventually and hopefully, we will actually make brands more accountable for all the actions that they're doing. And with more and more people being aware of these things that are not always great about global or local brands, will just push us towards the brighter side. That's my one example about the good that's coming out of anti-globalization. And then the bad side, I think my number one bad that's coming out of anti-globalization is the polarization, the not like fanatic nationalism that's coming out of it. And these probably are referring to different segments of consumers, like the ones that are becoming more aware of the good and the bad of brands, perhaps are not the same as the ones that are going fanatic nationalistic or are supporting these fanatic nationalist ideas. Because, and I'm saying that's my number one bad, because it is really hurting the coexistence of diverse groups. Yeah, like when we see people that are cheering ICE on while ICE is deporting people that are actually American citizens, I don't think that's a great thing. So that's slightly the bad of the number one bad that's coming out of anti-globalization, sentiments that are against diversity.
Excellent. Thank you, Erin. I'm going to go to Stan now. Stan, this comes from the Q&A, and I'm going to take the second part of it. As the demographics diverge, right, across countries, how can international marketers develop cross-generational brand strategies, balancing the need for trust and tradition with older consumers against the need for innovation and global appeal for younger consumers without sacrificing brand coherence in the process?
Yeah, yeah, that last piece is really just the tricky part, isn't it? First of all, just kind of point of clarification, I don't think the comment said need for trust. Actually, the papers I found would suggest that the older populations are generally more trusting, but they're more risk averse. So while they still may have a need for trust, they're just kind of inherently more trustful. So I don't think they're lacking for trust in that sense, but they may very well may need more reassurances. And I suspect, the comment about tradition does seem to kind of align pretty well with like national identification and so forth, and what we just kind of might generally assume about older populations and their lack of adoption of new technology, for example. But this is really, one of the points I was trying to raise with respect to like this more nationally identified consumer responds better to local consumer culture positioning. So that's kind of an analog to what this question is, that if global brands have to rely more and more on local positioning, that's really, for the most part, puts a lot of tension on trying to develop a global brand. And if you have even if it's the same brand and that brand is manifesting itself in different forms and different ways across the world, then you're losing that coherence in the brand. And perhaps there are ways in some large markets to maybe have it individualized a little bit. My mind goes back to the example, and it's a little bit of an outdated example now, I guess, but of like KFC in China, how it was so positioned quite differently in China than it was in just about anywhere else in the world. I recall pretty amusingly that hearing that young Chinese couples, teenagers, would go to KFC for a date, as if it was like a trendy, fun place to go for a date. And you know, at least for an American consumer, the thought of bringing a date to a KFC would be the first and best way to make sure that is your last date with that person. So, so I don't know. I think there's, you know, perhaps, you know, cross-generational. Wow, that's, I mean, it's almost like cross-national segments might be a more fruitful avenue or easier to develop than cross-generational segments, just because, you know, the histories, people's histories and preferences, you know, vary so much. And as we get older, our preferences start to get a little more locked in and immovable, if you will. So I don't know. I wish I had a better answer to that. I think the cross-generational piece of it is a real struggle. But I would recommend that, you know, from a marketing strategy perspective, probably, well, might be a better seen in trying to identify more cross-national segments. So yeah, again, that national, you know, cross-national youth segment, or even segments within the youth segment, and older segments alike. So hopefully that gives some
Yeah.
context.
Excellent, excellent. Fabian, and this comes from the Q&A as well. So it's going to be somewhat related to the last question. To your point of declining fertility and aging populations in developed economies, how can IB balance innovation for both aging consumers in the West and young consumers in emerging markets without creating sort of conflict of not only brand and brand messaging, but also for the firm itself trying to satisfy very different populations?
Yes, I saw that question. It's a very good question to ask. And you told us we can be a bit provocative, but I think that's going to be very challenging. You're not going to sell, you know, you use brand name A and then you sell it to both types of groups, because they're fundamentally differently motivated at different life stage. And you see this. There's already lots of conflict between age groups and societies, not very aggressively, but openly. You know, the ones that have the money was the ones that don't have the money, which is correlated with age and tenure in the job market, etc. So I think for companies, there's several ways how they can do this. One way is basically you focus on one generational cohort. So we see this happening all the time. Another way would be you go a route like Samsung does. You have basically different divisions which are for different purposes. You have, you know, the Galaxy line with their smartphone, which is clearly right now very youth driven, very AI driven, etc. But you might also have devices that are targeting a different age population for various reasons, and you try to keep these somewhat separate because you reach out to your consumers or to the target across different channels. And if you are a company like Samsung, and you can name any sort of larger entertainment company, I think this works because they have the size and they have the kind of the consumer demand for their products. If you're a smaller company, let's say you're not competing with something like Samsung, I don't see, for instance, Starbucks, large company, but not Samsung. I don't see them offering, you know, one drink which is exclusive for youth cohort and one drink which is sort of more for an elderly cohort. I think this will create conflict. So that's something they need to solve. And for this, focus on what you're good at, I'd say, with the
Excellent.
exception of some others.
Excellent. Thank you. So we are going to run now into a lightning round. I know you are three scholars who are heavily utilized in the journals for reviewers and editing. So we're going to come at you with quick questions, maybe controversial questions. We'll start with Flavia, and then we'll just sort of cycle through the alphabet each time, and we'll try to get in as many questions as possible to provide guidance to our scholars based upon what the questions they ask. I'd ask you to try to keep your answers short, not too short, but short and concise so we can get as many questions in. I'm going to start with the first question. I'm going to try to be provocative. Everyone's talking about we should be doing research in Africa. However, when I do my study in Nigeria, all the journals reject it.
Hmm.
Why? Fabian?
They shouldn't reject it. It depends on how you do it. There shouldn't be anything that hinders you in it. And I have an anecdote for that. There's some journals that actually do developmental work. They get data and insights from Africa, qualitative, by the way. And they sat down with the author and said, look, this is cool. And we'll work together and we make this happen. And voila, young PhD student somewhere from South Africa has a journal of business venturing. So there's ways. If you do everything by the book, it shouldn't harm you from publishing in the biggest journals.
Dan? Same question.
Oh, same question.
Same question.
Okay. I would say there's probably likely bias built in there and lack of trust in terms of the credibility of the data. Like if it's especially if it's like primary data being gathered, probably, yeah. I mean, bias against, whether the education systems there with respect to the authors, which could be playing it. I mean, you don't know who the authors are, but it's almost kind of, you can infer there's probably a decent chance that if the data is being gathered there, that the authors are also from there. So potentially bias there. You would hope that would not play into it, but people are people, and I think it can creep in there. And then finally would be, really to bolster Fabian's point, maybe a little lack of foresight with the reviewers or the editors to see the potential in it. But yeah, I agree with the premise of the question. It's like we always ask about, there's always this potential, and we need foreign data, or especially data from less represented places. And when you bring it, it's not always welcomed, unfortunately.
Excellent. Ira?
I agree with Fabian and Stan. I don't know if I have a lot to add to what they said. However, perhaps asking for help from scholars like Fabian. Fabian would totally help you with like publishing in IMR, for example. Just like asking for help. Also, Aishagul and Timo and Stan, they have actually like guided me so much with, what I can do with this project if it has promise, and anything that is, done in Nigeria in a way that has promise. Hopefully we'll get some guidance from the reviewers or the editor in terms of, how can it be tweaked or reshaped or pivoted or grown in a way that it can actually be published in that paper. So my one piece of advice would be like ask around to people who are leaders at that journal to see how you can reshape your work to get published there. That should help.
Excellent, excellent. So the next question is going to go to this general concept of migration shifts, demographic shifts. So you've all spoken about value shifts within countries, right? Then one of the number one things used in a lot of research is Hofstede scores. So Fabian, we'll start with you. Are Hofstede scores appropriate or relevant in a time of changing demographics? And so should we be accepting them in the publication process?
Yes and no. So Hofstede did fantastic work at that point, and it brought a lot of insights. But we all know that it was a bit of a limited data set in terms of it was too focused. So if you want to use Hofstede, as long as you measure it on the individual level, you're absolutely good, because that shouldn't change with anything. And there's ways you can, do cluster analysis, latent profile analysis on country groups, and you find some nuances there. The only thing is use the individual measures, and there are individual measures for Hofstede, there's for Schwartz and some other of these types of variables. So if these are used, why not? If it's the country variable, not so good.
Stan?
Years ago, I saw I won't throw him under the bus, but a very esteemed, I won't speak on his behalf, I guess, but a very, very esteemed marketing publisher get involved in this debate about Hofstede and how it's atheoretical. But I remember him saying at the AMA conference, gosh, probably 17, 18 years ago, but he says, but it just works. It works. There's explanatory power there. So while we can criticize it tremendously for being atheoretical, and then especially to the point of the question about, with increasingly diverse societies potentially changing values in societies, certainly a good point to make. And layer on that the recent research that even draws into question whether many of those 4, 5, 6 values in Hofstede's even really exist anymore outside of individualism, collectivism. So excellent question. I think I think honestly it may be a little bit results driven. If it's having explanatory power, there must be something there. But I think we need to be a little careful about the theoretical explanation that we attach to that as well.
Aaron?
Yes and no, as Fabian said, where I did my dissertation with my advisor, Dr. Yaprak and Dr. Bagosi, on scale development. And I know that it takes a lot of blood, tears, and sweat to come up with a scale, and therefore Hofstede's scale being so rigorous is a lot of work to develop. And so I have a lot of respect for it, and it does work often. However, two things. First one is that we are very diverse in the world right now. So taking it country-based is not always working. You can use it in terms of different, like across different ethnicities, across different, not necessarily nations, but ethnicities or smaller groups of people, and it tends to work a little bit better that way. However, it does need to be updated in ways in which that we're seeing the society change. Also, if you look at the questions, items one by one, like there are a lot of old-fashioned items in there that perhaps need some updating as well. One of the ones that I remember is like whenever elderly gets on the bus, I give my place to the elderly. Well, like we don't necessarily use buses all that often anymore in the US specifically. Like there's no public transportation. So like, you can definitely word that item in a very contemporary way, but it hasn't happened. So maybe like looking at it from the perspective of today's world could also aid the scale to be a better scale overall.
David, may I interject one quick comment on that, if you don't mind?
Sure.
I do wonder though, Aaron bringing up elderly, it does make me wonder if it can still offer clues into marketing to an old age consumer, because these values maybe are kind of more tightly tied to traditional cultures when cultures were more monolithic. So it might offer some clues there, and would be interesting to see if the values, for the old are drastically different from those of the young in that respect.
Excellent. So we have very few minutes left, so I'm going to ask you for real short answers on this one. So we'll still go through the same. This is the last question. At webinars, at conferences, everyone always encourages people to do qualitative research so we can gain thick, rich description and understanding. But when I look at the journals, there are very few qualitative papers that seem to get through the process towards publication. As a junior scholar in need of publications, what would you advise me to maybe make that a smaller portion of my portfolio or a larger portion of my portfolio? Fabian?
I'm not a qualitative researcher. I get a lot of qualitative work for IMR. And the biggest mistake I always see is great ideas, good theory, even good data, 50, 60 interviews sometimes, which is a lot. But then the analysis of the data is suffering. There's not really an effort to actually show that the qual data shows what you're trying to do. So you limit yourself with one or two quotes, which are okay, but then, try to show the rest as well. Make a table where you have selective quotes, use the appendix. And whether this gets published at the end is a different question, but it should be shown in the first review round that you've done the work, and then there shouldn't be anything that distracts you from it.
Dan?
Smaller.
Excellent. Ira?
I do qualitative work and I sometimes suffer as this person is suffering as well. So solidarity there. But the thing is, I think specifically in international marketing, qualitative work gets the feedback that it needs to be supported with experiments or surveys. So that's what I do. However, that's not always correct. And also in international marketing, we are lacking qualitative work reviewers in a way that a lot of the reviewers are quant, they understand qualitative, but that's not their main thing. So they want to see some quant mixed in with qual to be able to get evidence for the qualitative work. I'm not purely qualitative, so I'm not super offended by that feedback, but pure qualitative people seem to be highly offended by that feedback. Um 50-50 maybe, not as less as Stan is saying, but keep quant in there, especially if you want to be in international marketing, because we're very quant heavy still, and we're going through the switch of being more accepting to qualitative, but we need quant as well right now at the moment.
Excellent, excellent. So as we draw this to a close, I'd first like to say thank you all for just absolutely wonderful, thought-provoking presentations. Greatly appreciate your time and you sharing your insights with our audience. Also, a big shout out and thank you to all of the participants who came, all the attendees for the webinar. Absolutely wonderful, great questions. Thank you for coming. Thank you for participating. I want to give a large shout out to the staff at Texas A&M University, SIBS, and Michigan State University, Cyber, who Amit and I could not do this webinar without such great support from the staff. And lastly, I'd like to say thank you to Amit for continuing this journey with me as we work through these Research Spotlight Series webinars. Amit, I'll let you have the last words. Thank you all for coming.
David, thank you so much. You've been a great co-host and, as always, a great moderator. Thank you. It was a pleasure. This is our 15th Research Spotlight, and we've covered a lot of interesting topics and had a large number of faculty members who came here to talk about their wonderful ideas, research suggestions. And this event was one of those too. Fabian, Stan, and Uram did a very good job. Thank you for joining us today and for sharing useful thoughts and research ideas on changing demographics and the implication of this interesting phenomenon on research in global marketing and international business. I would also like to thank the participants for joining us for this interesting panel and for all the questions that we have received. This was one of the most active audiences that we have had recently. So I think, that is a big plus. And of course, I would like to use this opportunity to thank our teams at MSU and Texas A&M Cybers. Without them, as David indicated, this would not have been possible. We're looking forward to seeing you again in one of our Research Spotlight webinars in the future. And stay tuned. We're going to send more information and we'll invite you to our webinars in the future. Thank you very much.